what does the future look like, and what does the return to work look like? And that, as I say, that's going to be the focus of today's session. Some of the focus over the last few weeks has been on things like, how do we deal with the sort of government support that's in place? For many of us working in internal communications, that's been around how do you manage things like furloughs? How do you manage kind of, some of the kind of juxtaposition of, organisations which maybe kind of take advantage of government support, but at the same time are potentially looking at also paying out dividends to their shareholders, and how do you manage the sort of reputational challenges around that, and I suppose the moral and ethical dimension to that too. Certainly I know that Montfort, a lot of the work that we've been doing is working with our clients around how do you manage quite complex pay situations, and how do you work with sort of employee representatives and unions to try and kind of manage an equitable kind of solution to that, something that helps the long-term sustainability of the organisation, but also feels fair in terms of the way that employees are treated. And then sadly, as I say, we're beginning to see an increase in redundancies, or in the case of the example there at the top of the redundancy sort of clippings we've got there, people actually threatened with redundancy if they don't come into work, which clearly is again goes back to the ethical concerns that I know many of us have had. We're also seeing a big debate. It was a debate before the crisis, but I think it's as with a lot of things through the pandemic has accelerated. We're beginning to see some further debate around executive remuneration, and particularly where organisations have taken advantage of government support, whether it's acceptable that people will be taking large bonuses and pay at a time when people might be being furloughed or indeed being laid off. But I suppose more positively, there's a shift to debate around what going back to work will look like, and things around social distancing and the rules and guidelines that would need to be put in place so that people could feel safe back at work, and what that might mean in different working environments, whether it's in a retail store, whether it's in a manufacturing business, whether it's obviously an office environment, and what the new normal will look like in terms of the way that we work. And indeed some of the habits which I know that Hazel will talk a bit about later, but where some of the new habits that have been formed over the course of the last few weeks, where some of those habits might actually be retained when we go back into the physical workplace. For example, things like these sort of virtual working, whether that will actually become more an integral part of the way that we work going forward. And another thing that's become a big part of the debate has been around people's both physical and mental health. And a large part of this will be about how we consider how we resume business activity in a way that mitigates potential criticism from a variety of sources, whether it's our own people, whether it's unions, whether it's media and politicians. And as I've just outlined, there's sort of increased scrutiny really of the way that organisations are conducting themselves through this crisis. So it really does need a well-prepared and aligned internal and external communications approach to try and mitigate and minimise disruption to the business, but also any reputational damage. And I think a key aspect of that, as it would be with any crisis, is listening to your employees, understanding the issues that they might have, and acting on those concerns. So very visibly demonstrating that you get what they're worried about, and that you can act in a way which provides reassurance and confidence that you are a responsible employer and behaving with the right level of duty of care. And in order to achieve that, preparation is going to be key. You need to demonstrate that you've taken all the steps to protect workers and, of course, the wider community. Obviously, we know with a virus like this, the contagion that it could potentially have. So making sure that you're protecting workers, their families, and the wider community. A key part of the approach, therefore, is to kind of have a very strong narrative to make sure that people understand exactly the steps that you're taking, and the role that they can play in terms of resumption of business and indeed in terms of the wider recovery for the business and indeed the economy. I think there's an opportunity actually there in terms of creating, when people are beginning to come back into the physical workplace, to create a renewed sense of pride, a renewed sense of togetherness, I think when people are coming back off of furlough, I think there's an opportunity to welcome those people back into the fold. And as I said before, I think that that's all in the context of people expecting more from employers, more from organisations, and that there's a significant expectation among the wider public that people will act responsibly and that people will be a good employer. And another consideration, I think, is around you know, how you prepare your line managers, the people who have sort of significant responsibility for setting the tone within the organisation, where you might look at a reorientation package, a training package, looking again at almost a reinduction of people back into the organisation, where they can talk not just about the practicalities of dealing with, you know, what the new normal looks like in terms of the guidelines, but also sort of reflecting on kind of what your purpose and values and wider responsibilities as an employer might look like. So we think those are all things that you might want to think about and your planning in terms of return to work.
So looking forward now, what are the challenges? And we know, and we keep on hearing, that things are going to be very different, and the requirement now is for organisations to think about, well, what might that difference be? What are the scenarios? What are the challenges facing our partners, our suppliers and other stakeholders? How might things impact them as well as us? And therefore, what sort of challenge might that bring to the way we need to work and manage our organisation in the future? So, and I think communicators have a potentially big role to play in this, because the some of the key skills of the profession, the ability to facilitate, to clarify, to be quite analytical about outcomes, and to help to bring communities together for good conversations. So whilst these risks analysis need to take place, the scenario planning needs to occur, I think if communicators are not directly involved in those conversations, then I think there's an opportunity to suggest that you should be. And then of course that then leads to recovery. What does the conclusion of those conversations suggest about how organisations might need to change and adapt, and therefore what needs to be put in place on a phased basis as we do see a return to work. And I think a lot of people are anticipating changes to supply chain management, changes to work processes, different sort of practices being put in place. And of course, communication has a big role to play in articulating and clarifying that and helping the relevant people understand what those changes are and how that impacts their work, whilst of course managing the different audience needs based on a whole variety of situations. If you're working with an organisation that spans different countries, there'll be different national procedures in place, different phases of experiences of people returning to work, and even within a single country, a lot of those different scenarios occurring to different audience groups. So again, as communicators, we'll need to understand those different situations and manage them expertly, and that's going to be very demanding amongst all the other changes that we'll need to help. We've heard a lot recently about needing to increase organisation resilience as we move forward, which is about the idea of having slack and capability built into systems for organisations to have the facility to respond to crises as they occur, perhaps more flexibly than they were able to at the start of this crisis. So there's a demand at the moment for organisations to look at how they can increase resilience, and that leads to, I think, a debate that needs to be had between, well, how much control do we want to put in place, and how much flexibility and freedom do we want to give people to make decisions that affect their work. But resilience is going to need a little bit more procedure and control. So there is a bit of a sacrifice to be made about that in the context of personal freedom. So we can see organisations potentially becoming a little bit more rule-bound with more explicit planning in place versus the move that we were beginning to see around creating opportunities for people to experiment and have flexibility to have a bit more personal choice. And I think that will have an impact on the role of leaders. We've spoken a lot in the past about leaders as role models and helping to lead teams to have a debate and a dialogue about the best way to do their work. But if we're going to move down this route of resilience, we may find that leaders have to be a little bit more commanding and demanding in the way they guide and indeed perhaps more instruct teams to work in the way that the procedure requires. On the flip side, we've seen that people have adapted very quickly to working collaboratively online using all the various technologies that are available. And again, that was a move that was happening, particularly amongst organisations that have invested in digital transformation recently. So all the technology that we've been using increasingly as a result of the work at home requirement has been available for quite some time, and many organisations have become quite practiced in remote working and collaborative working across the technology. But there's been a huge shift in people's readiness, capability, degree of comfort to do that. So again, we can expect as a consequence of that, I mean, we hear many organisations talking about the need to break down silos to help to create better connections across organisations for improved process and delivery. So I think as a result of this habit of becoming better aware of the technology and more comfortable in using it, we will see a breakdown of silos, better connectivity across organisations, and people using the technology much more actively for not just meetings, but remotely managed virtual workshops and a whole variety of collaborative working. And if organisations, in order to have this greater resilience, are going to pursue routes which aren't as low cost a solution as we were all working to before. I mean, in the manufacturing sector, there's been, for quite some time, a focus on lean manufacturing technologies, just-in-time delivery. Everything's been based on the most efficient way of operating. If that's going to change, because we need to build more resilience and greater slack, we're going to move to a slightly higher cost way of operating, and not only are we going to need to make difficult decisions about that, but we're going to need to explain that to our audiences who might be thinking, why don't we do this in a more efficient, cost-effective way? So some more challenges there. And the final box on the right-hand side is the broader reputation management issue, which I think could have an impact on the way we look at the way we want to position our organisations, particularly in terms of values and community relationships. I think it's been quite fascinating to observe how individuals and institutions and organisations have indeed become much more sort of socially collaborative. A lot of examples of generous sharing of technologies and capabilities, and providing a whole range of opportunities for helping the community at large. And that just might lead to a debate, or could even trigger an opportunity to have a conversation about what does that mean about where we stand as an organisation in terms of focus on profit versus focus on social responsibility in the community. Again, a debate which has been happening for quite some time, but this could create a slightly different focus and flavour in the nature of the conversations we have moving forward. So I think quite a lot of issues ruling on the agenda as a consequence of the experience we're all having. And at the bottom of the slide there, I think this really has put communicators at the forefront of thinking about the future of organisations, and at the forefront of dealing with some of the critical issues on the day-to-day management issue right now. So I think there really is a huge opportunity for communicators to take to help shape those agendas and to facilitate those conversations, and to help to deliver potentially a different post-pandemic culture outcome than otherwise might be the case.
I'm Hazel Carter. I'm the CEO of a group of business psychologists I founded about 20 years ago. A bit of human behaviour I want to focus on today is people, place and habit. You've heard quite a bit about them, but yes, we're going to talk in more detail about these aspects. So I want to start with people, because we are deeply social creatures, and unless you are a really very extreme and clear introvert, most people will find the whole point of social isolation quite painful. If you put people in an fMRI scanner, you'll see the same parts of their brain will light up as physical pain when we have this sense of social loss. And people will experience often the social disconnection as loss. So you see, we grieve the loss of colleagues, we grieve the loss of connection. And also we think about what we're going to miss when we start to think about returning to work. We miss our office, we miss our team, we miss the way things were. But also we think about the colleagues who may not be there when we get back. We think about the colleagues whose maybe lives are going to be forever changed by this experience. And this is where we have to consider grief, because we don't just have things we really have lost, we have anticipatory grief. So this is grief, things that haven't actually happened yet, things where we worry about losing a parent one day, when people have had a terminal diagnosis. But we do worry, and the virus, because it's unseen, can affect our psychological safety, and that can cause a real problem. So this is what organisations can do, is to understand the stages of grief, to help people to move through them a little more rapidly. Now, you might be familiar, if anyone's familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, might be thinking, hang on, isn't there 5 stages? David Kessler, who worked with Elizabeth, added a 6th stage, and I wanted to cover all of them so you could get a sense of what they look like now. I think we all saw denial. In the very early stages, when people were, oh, it's not going to be an issue, it's not going to be a problem, don't know what's going on, and we saw a huge amount of denial going on. It rapidly morphed into that sense of, what? You're making me stay home with the kids? What do you mean I can't go to the park? What do you mean I can't do this, isn't it? So all of that sense of outrage and venom that got vented all sorts of different weird ways, very typical. Now, these are not always linear. People can go in cycles, it's a scaffold, they can go in different orders. But we also saw a bit of bargaining. People start to get into that mindset of almost, so if I do a couple of weeks of social distancing, can I get more loo rolls? So you get this bit, and then you'll start to see different types of emotion emerge. We see sadness. Suddenly you'll get a sense of all those people, all those families. Think about the businesses affected. This is awful. And all the sadness and the negative emotion starts to emerge. And that's when you usually get to the final stage, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's original end of the 5 stages, which is acceptance. Acceptance means we start to think, okay, whether I like it or not, this is happening. I need to learn to work from home, or I need to learn to think about what the new world looks like. I need to learn to work virtually. I can do this. And with acceptance comes control. With acceptance comes power. With acceptance comes serenity. All these elements of acceptance tends to help us to move through things. What was interesting is David Kessler, who added the 6th stage, said also, can we find meaning? Now, I don't mean was a reason for the pandemic, because I think there's a few conspiracy theories you can do with that one. But can you find some sense of meaning in the experience to make it meaningful? As in, what have we learned about ourselves? What have we learned about what we value and what we don't? What really mattered and what really didn't? And that is how we can make this kind of experience really meaningful. Now, the idea is the more you can understand people's process through these areas of grief, and the more you can get people to talk about and to label their emotions through grief, the faster they can move through them. And I noticed from looking at some of the chats coming up that some of you work in international settings, and I know people express grief differently in different countries. The Brits are notoriously rubbish at dealing with death and dying, so talking about grief is particularly hard. But getting people to talk about their emotions, as I said, much healthier to get people to move through them faster. But some of the emotions people are expressing is not grief, but relief. And that's when you could be looking at something that's closer to survivor syndrome, where people feel almost bad that they didn't get COVID, that they weren't affected, they quite enjoyed being locked in with their family, that all that sense of actually, I was okay, my business is okay, and that's really interesting. And we'll see a little bit more effect. Now, people who are affected, the organisational symptoms you're watching out for tends to be people who get very demotivated, almost irritable. Sometimes you see a type of lethargy, or they're very questioning, very challenging, just questioning the meaning of everything. That can often be linked to a type of survivor syndrome. And the solution, there are 3 key steps. The first is you remind people that if you look back, yeah, everybody could think they could do things differently, but nobody can change the past and nobody can predict the future. The second tip is to share experiences with other people who've been through the same thing, to see that often what you're feeling is not atypical. And the third is to recognise that you did the best you could with what you had in the circumstances. And they are all communication challenges. So as communicators, you have a vital role to help people to really think about and talk, because this is all a talking solution to the issue, to get people to talk about and share and connect, and that moves them through them. But also what makes people feel more stable during these kind of times is to know what's not changing. And that settles people down. And as Scott said, one of the things that doesn't tend to change is your purpose, your sense of your mission, your values, and reminding people of those gives them that psychological anchor and makes them feel a bit steadier. Now, of course, the one thing that people keep talking about is, oh, you know, I can't wait to get back to normal. And the one thing I would say psychologically, not possible. So if we get old normal is not possible, we can only have new normal. And what we've got to figure out is how to take the best of one into the new. So if we think about what did old normal look like? So yeah, we were deeply connected to place. Think about how odd the fuss about hot desking now feels when we all just got sent home. So people were deeply connected to place. It really matters to many people, the psychological connection to place. And also people, the amount of times meetings happened, how much time did we spend on trains and planes to make meetings that lasted an hour? And because people didn't realise that many meetings are a meeting of minds. And similarly, when it came to leadership, it was all around controlling tasks. So many leaders didn't move past that. And then we get to identity. Identity, I've grouped all these together, but identity, often people kept focusing on the ones to co-locate their team, they want to protect their teams, or about a lot of siloed working, as Jerome mentioned, working against other teams, and they want to keep their team together. So anything that affects their team and their team cohesion causes pain, and that's social pain again. But of course, when those teams come back, the stronger the team identity can actually cause a greater risk of survivor syndrome, because the team doesn't want to lose a single member. Now, if we think about what does that mean in the new normal sense, well, what I hope is, absolutely, we are thinking about a greater connection to purpose rather than place, being a little less worried about where things happen, and actually focus more on doing things in the right place, where they need to be, not always in the same place. And I'm not saying you literally need to be sitting on a rock in the middle of nowhere, but it's thinking more that leadership needs to be, again, about focusing on outcome, not task. And it always should have been, to be fair, but you know, most people didn't get it. And then again, when it comes to identity, we can have another go at getting our identity focused on tribe or organizational level. Because if you can be identified with not just the people who sit a few feet away from you, but the people who share your passion, your purpose, what matters, that's really cool. Then you can defend your principles, and you can be a lot more fluid and flexible about who you need to be working with and when and for what purpose. One of the things I think will have been missed, that what we've gained through this process is all around the flexibility that we gained. I think what people have really missed is a bit of connectivity, and that's really interesting. And so I would say personally, when we can, I think we should hug more. That's just a personal thing. Some people aren't very tactile. And if we're thinking about autonomy, one of the things that people have really been telling me in all of my class that they've loved about the new way is the autonomy they get with flexible working. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the psychology of autonomy, because once you are paid enough to take money off the table, autonomy is a major motivator. Anyone who's read Dan Pink's Drive will know this. But there was an amazing study that looked at the impact of autonomy on human beings. So they looked at a care home and they gave them pot plants. There's the picture. On floor 1, they were given these pot plants and they were told, keep the pot plants alive, but they gave them no control. They were told the care assistants will water them, the researchers will come in on a Wednesday and we'll come and see how you're doing keeping your pot plants alive. But that was it, no control. On floor 3, they were told, keep your pot plants alive, you can do whatever it takes to do that. We can give you whatever help you need. When would you like to see the researcher? And while we're at it, what tips or ideas have you got for improving the way we run this home? So they're given huge amounts of autonomy and control and freedom. Eventually, they actually had to suspend the experiment because what they noticed was twice as many had died on floor 1 as floor 3. But I do mean people and not pot plants. Now, when they suspended the experiment, very rapidly the death rate on floor 3 accelerated and caught up and took over that on floor 1. And what that showed us, it actually is worse to have had autonomy and then lost it than to have never had it at all. So one thing as we think about returning to work, I would say, is for those teams who've been given an unused to doses of autonomy, I'd be very careful about how you take it away. Now, yeah, that's going to be a bit of a challenge for some leaders, but hey, we're working in a new normal world, aren't we? So, yeah, I think while we're talking about changing habits, I think we need to think very differently about how we change behaviour, because when people tend to think about changing behaviour, they usually tend to think in terms of what do we want people to do differently, but they don't deconstruct it enough to think about what those behaviours actually mean, because habits are constructed of 3 core elements. We have the cue, I'm the hamster, I see the shiny ball, and then we have the routine, ooh, I run in the ball, and then we have the reward, I feel great, or I want to do it again. And we all have this, the way we're conditioned. Our brains are remarkably lazy. There's a great thing called cognitive miserliness, where we preserve energy and effort by having lots of elements of our behaviour being automatic. And the cue triggers the automatic behaviour. There's a great amount of research at the moment that suggests we should stop focusing on the cue, start thinking about changing those routines, and eventually the cue triggers the right routine or a different routine, and we get good rewards. So we can also think about making sure we get great rewards for the right routine. So we don't keep changing the cue. So this way, the next time someone says, we need a meeting, it isn't an automatic, our routine we run is, oh, get the train timetable. It could be, let's see who's available online. New routine, new reward, new outcome. So we're just trying to think very differently about how we change those behaviours. And what you start to see is that people become very quickly attuned to new ways of working. And it's really interesting because then it starts to become new, no energy or effort. If you want to get a sense of the initial energy it takes to change habits, whichever hand you normally write with, if you've got a pen handy, swap hands and try and write your name with your other hand. And what you'll suddenly find is something that you can normally do without any energy or effort. Doesn't know you have to think about it. You suddenly have to really concentrate because every element of it suddenly becomes conscious. But if you were to practice over and over again, eventually that also can become very effortless. And that's what we want behaviourally, effortless change of behaviours. So, okay, can we see this going back to work in a new light? Well, I would say the old ways have gone and the new ways are not yet set in stone. So it is time to choose. You can choose who you want to be when you've finished paying for who you had to be, to paraphrase Carl Jung. And it's deciding what new habits do you want, what new behaviours do you want to create, what routines can you set in stone as people go back to work, because the very best time to change is when things are already changing, as many of you already know as change professionals. But one thing I know in a world that no longer allows people to shake hands is when to stop talking and take a bow. Thank you very much.